I don't think that that you people out there are getting what I'm trying to get across in regarding that if God didn't exist, you couldn't even imagine him. You couldn't think him up. And I'm going to try to convey it as best as I can. You can think up imaginary things, but they're always based upon something that you can observe around you, or something that we know exists, in order for us to be able to conceptualize it. In fact, you can't even create something imaginary without some kind of a first having an example on your own. You can't even think it up. You can't even imagine it. And therefore, you can't even imagine the existence of God and the conceptualization of a God unless one of two things. Either we had an example of it, or we were shown by this God that he existed. So if God didn't exist, you couldn't even think him up. And here's the thing. Even if it was possible for you to think something up that actually never existed before, where you had no reference to it, and like I said, it's impossible. You couldn't even imagine it, because man needs a reference. Even if you could think him up, even if you could think something up that doesn't exist, and you have absolutely no experience with it, no reference to it, nothing in the world around you to conceptualize it, even if you were able to have the idea, you wouldn't be able to convey that idea to other minds because they couldn't grasp it. You wouldn't be able to, for that matter, you wouldn't be able to grasp it because you need a reference too. So you couldn't even think of it. But even in the benefit of the doubt, if you could do what God did, you couldn't conceptualize creating something out of nothing. You couldn't even conceptualize it. It's just, you couldn't do it. But say you could. Just say, for example, that you actually could. Then how would you go about conveying this idea to others, to other minds, so that they could grasp it? And yet we have this God that you couldn't even imagine, because you can't even think of other things independent of some type of an example to describe it, to give it life in the minds of other people. You couldn't even come up with this God, and even if you could, you wouldn't be able to convey it to other people. And yet, not only do we have this knowledge of God, but we are able to also convey the conception of God to other people, so that they too can understand it. So this is an evidence that God exists. Because even if you could think it up, you couldn't convey it. I mean, you couldn't convey it to other minds. So that to me is a powerful evidence that God exists. And prove me wrong. Can you actually think up something that doesn't exist, that you have absolutely no reference to? I mean, if that were the case, you couldn't even describe it. And if you couldn't describe it, then you couldn't convey it to other minds. And yet this God is conveyed to other people with relative ease, if they're listening to it. And even people who don't believe in God understand the conception, the concept, which in and of itself is an evidence that they already know that God exists, because they understand the concept. If they didn't know that God existed beyond any shadow of a doubt, somewhere deep down inside of them, even if you tried to explain God, they couldn't even conceptualize the idea in their head, because they have no reference to it in their brain. And yet, everybody that you talk to, primitive and educated alike, can grasp this conception of God. Where'd that come from? That is an evidence that God indeed has shown himself to every human being. Because even if I had the idea of God, how would I convey that idea to another mind who doesn't believe in God and yet didn't have any kind of a reference. I mean, you can't think of it. Go ahead and continue to try to think up something that doesn't exist. You can't even imagine it. And that's what I'm trying to convey. I know it's a heavy concept, but really think about it. You can't even conceptualize it unless you have some kind of a reference point. Oh, once you understand that God exists, and God has already said that He's revealed it to every person, then you can create other gods and other spiritual beings, because now you understand about God, and God is a spirit. So now there's your reference point. So now you can go ahead and create all kinds of different spiritual beings with your imagination. But your first example was God Himself. And He revealed Himself to you and to every human being, so that we do know that He exists. Because if you didn't know that He existed, you couldn't even your brain couldn't even grasp the concept of God. But you are able to grasp the concept. So therefore, you must know somewhere deep down inside that God exists. And I'm not even sure if I'm conveying that message accurately enough to still hit home. But it's something to think about anyway.